So, since I've described Honey to you, I'll now spend a little bit of time telling you what I know about her family. And to be honest, compared to the Peebles side of the family, it's not much. Honey's mother was Effie Cameron, and her family originally came to Canada in the early 1800s during the end of, no, wait a minute. Yeah, 1800s, the 19th century. That would be during the end of the clearances in Scotland. They lived in Canada for 2 or 3 generations, and then Effie's family immigrated to the United States. For those of you who don't know what the clearances in Scotland are, a little history lesson here. Um, After James the First of England, James the Sixth of Scotland, became king, he was the heir and inherited the British throne right after Elizabeth the First. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And he began the process of anglicizing Scotland. Up until that time, lairds in Scotland were viewed by their people and by themselves, I think, as the fathers of their clans and the leaders of their clans. The land belonged to the clan, not to the laird. The laird was simply the authority who made the decisions for the clan and did what was best, in his opinion, for the clan. But after they had gone through James the First and James the Second and Charles the First and Cromwell and so on, a lot of the lairds married into the English aristocracy and inherited titles in England. And a lot of English lairds, English lords, married into the clans of Scotland and ended up inheriting the title of laird. And because the English system was so much different, where the lord owned the land and the people rented from them or leased from them the property that they worked, they took that mindset back to Scotland. And so, where you had generations of people living in the same bothy and working the same land and giving a percentage of what they earned in a year to the laird started setting you owe me, this is how much rent you have to pay. No matter if your family starves or not, this is, instead of a percentage, they were having to pay a rent. It wasn't long until they discovered that the land in Scotland, unlike England, is quite difficult to farm. Cattle do well in some areas, but not in others. And they discovered that if they got rid of all the people and put sheep in their place, they could make a lot more money. So they started clearing the people off the land. That's called the clearances. They would literally go and burn down a person's house so they had no place to live and say, leave. You're not welcome here. We're putting sheep on this land. And that's what they did for, well, not quite 100 years. And so many of the displaced Scots immigrated to America or to Canada. And in the case of Effie's family, they went to Canada and then eventually came down to the United States. So that's basically what I know. The first Cameron in Grandma Effie's line was named John, but then they went to Donalds and Dougal's and stuff like that, and I think I have a picture somewhere of like 5 generations of Donald Camerons. I have pictures, and my grandmother has described to me different members of her family. I know she had twin uncles that she absolutely adored, but I don't know many stories of their family. So that's what I know. On the McAnally side, now, my grandmother told me that her father told her they were Black Irish. Now, I've heard that term a lot of times, but I don't think that there's anything, I don't know what they mean when they say Black Irish. My grandmother did have really, really dark hair. I can't say that it was black. My dad's hair was black, so I don't remember my grandmother before she started turning gray, so I don't know if her hair was actually black or not. She had remarkable eyes. When she was happy or laughing or into mischief, they were blue. But the rest of the time, they were kind of almost a slate gray. She said that her eyes were like her father's eyes. So her father was Lemuel McAnally, and the McAnallys came into the United States, into South Carolina, and for some reason you get back about, well, Lemuel, and Lemuel's father's name was Francis Marion. That's how come we knew it was South Carolina, because he was named after Francis Marion, the Revolutionary War hero known as the Swamp Fox. But somewhere in there, a cousin told me that there's a genetic problem where there's a possibility that an ancestor was either illegitimate or a cousin that was adopted or a child that was adopted and simply became a McAnally as adopted into the family. They were doing genetic research to see what they could find out, but I don't know how that turned out. But I'm pretty sure that at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the end of the 18th century, no, at the beginning, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the McAnallys came into South Carolina at the time that the Covenanters were being persecuted in Scotland and also in Ireland. They moved from Scotland to Ireland, and then to South Carolina. South Carolina had just become a colony, and they were trying to populate it. And so the governors of the colony of South Carolina were giving away a certain size parcel of land, and the equipment to clear the land, and a subsidy for a year to live on until you could bring in your first crop to anyone who would come over and promise to settle in South Carolina. And the Covenanters were, it was a religious thing that is probably too difficult to explain on in a story. You kind of have to draw out things. But the Covenanters were severely persecuted under James II. So that would be mid 16 to early 1700s. So 17th to 18th century. But they came to South Carolina, they settled, they were free to have their own religion. That religion, by the way, in the United States became Presbyterian. So, but South Carolina was settled by Covenanters. So, and since Honey's grandfather was named Francis Marion after the Swamp Fox, who was a South Carolina hero, pretty sure that they came from South Carolina. We know that they were at least back to Kentucky, and a lot of people went from South Carolina to Kentucky. So genetic problems, ancestry problems, it doesn't really matter. The ancestors came, the ancestors go, whatever. But that's that's my grandmother's family. My grandmother's grandfather, Francis Marion, lost a leg in accident with some kind of farm machinery. So he had a store, a mercantile, or something like that that he ran in Kansas. I don't know much more about him than that. I know that his sons all married and all had children, but one son died fairly young. That was Aunt Lou's husband. And one lived in Oklahoma, had a farm in Oklahoma, and my great grandfather homesteaded in New Mexico and in around House, and then moved down to Roswell, where he lived until he died. So that's what I can tell you about my grandmother's family. I don't know any stories about them. I don't remember my grandmother ever telling me stories about them. I know I don't remember Aunt Pete telling stories about them. But they were a close knit family. Both Aunt Pete and Honey corresponded frequently with their cousins in Kansas and in Oklahoma, and I don't know that they stayed in contact with any of the family in Canada. But that's what I know about my grandmother's family. And so I will end this little bit about Honey here and try to think of something else some other stories to continue this with. So I have my grandmother's family in New Mexico. I think I'll tell you a little bit about her family. My grandmother's favorite brother was Uncle Lester. Probably he was the closest in age to my grandmother, to Honey, and he was pretty easily wrapped around her little finger, I think. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to talk him into teaching her how to drive a car. Uncle Lester had probably one of the first automobile service stations and mechanic shop in the Roswell area. It wasn't in Roswell per se. I think it was out in East Grand Plains where their apple orchard was, and where my cousin Lester, who was named after Uncle Lester, still lives. Um, Uncle Lester died fairly young. He was married, but he and his wife Naomi never had any children because he was killed in, I believe it was a motorcycle accident. The next older brother was Uncle Raleigh. And Uncle Raleigh was one of those people that my grandmother didn't get along well with. He didn't like her too much, and she didn't like him too much, but they were family, and by God, they were going to act like family. So Uncle Raleigh moved to the homestead up by house after my great grandfather died. And he married the only daughter of the local owner of the mercantile and took over running the mercantile. In those days, it was pretty lucrative because there was a big farming community. Eventually, the climate changed and dryland farming was impossible, and water in those areas is pretty deep down, and so irrigation wasn't really, at least irrigating large parcels of land wasn't financially viable. So house kind of shrunk down to almost nothing. Aunt Audie and Uncle Raleigh had one daughter, Laura, and Laura was one of my daddy's favorite cousins. So we went quite frequently, a couple of times a year, up to visit Aunt Audie and Uncle Raleigh and Laura and her husband, Rufus. Rufus and Laura had three children: Jim, who and Pam. Pam is about 6 months older than I am. Jim is about 3 years older than I am. And then when I was 7 or 8, they had another little girl called Monty. I know that I'm 7 or 8 years older than Monty because I can remember being there and visiting when Laura was giving the baby Monty her bath in the kitchen sink. Pam is the only girl cousin that I ever had much to do with because, well, number one, I don't have very many girl cousins. And number two, the rest of them are a lot younger than I am. So, and Pam and I had this love-hate relationship because her grandparents were always telling my grandparents that Pam made straight A's and was on the honor roll. And Pam was one of those foo-foo little girls that wore all these cute little dresses that her mother made for her and never got them dirty and never tore out a waistband, never ripped out a hem, and was always the perfect little lady. And Lord, did I hear about how perfect Pam was, what good grades she made, what a little lady she was, and all of her accomplishments. While my grandparents were telling her grandparents that I was a straight A student and on the honor roll, no way, and that I was independent and talented, but in other ways, you know. And Pam heard about that, and she hated me, and I hated her until we got into college and started comparing notes. And she said, I think we were sitting in her dorm room one time, and I said, you know, I really didn't like you very much when we were growing up. I was so jealous that you always made straight A's and were always on the honor roll. And she says, well, why did you get jealous about that? You were always made straight A's and were on the honor roll. And we looked at each other and we laughed. And I said, oh, not until I was in high school did I make straight A's and be on the honor roll. And she said, well, yeah, that's the way it was for me as well. And we started comparing notes and finding out that our grandparents lied to each other quite a bit. Ended up, we became roommates. We shared an apartment in college and learned to really enjoy each other and really like each other. Now, Pam was one of those beautiful young women. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, which is strange because her mother had really dark hair like my grandmother. And so did her grandfather. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She never stepped out of her bedroom without her makeup on. Or if she did, it was only to dart into the bathroom so that she could get her makeup on. And she was always perfectly groomed, beautifully dressed. As a matter of fact, I remember when I had chemistry one semester, and my chemistry lab in the chemistry building at New Mexico State University, Pam and I both at that time lived in the dorm. And Pam worked for the Air Force ROTC to supplement her scholarships and to make it through college. She worked at the Air Force ROTC as a secretary for the professor of military, the Air Force professor of military science. And my chemistry lab on Tuesdays and Thursdays just happened to be at the same time that Pam's classes finished, and she would be walking down the hill from the dorm to the Air Force ROTC building right in front of the chemistry building. And I remember standing there talking, waiting for the class in front of us to exit the lab so that my lab group could go in. And we're standing out in front of the chemistry building. And everybody's talking, all this blah, 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 all this noise going around with everybody talking. And then pretty soon it starts getting quieter and quieter and quieter and quieter. And then nobody's talking. Well, you have to understand, when I went to New Mexico State, men outnumbered women by about 5-1. So my chemistry lab had exactly 3 women in it. The rest of the 20, 25 people in the chemistry lab were all men. So it got very silent. So I turned around to look and see what was going on. And all of the eyes, all these men had their eyes trained on this woman walking down the sidewalk. And she got right in front of me, and I thought, oh my God, that's Pam. Well, Pam passed out of sight, and all the noise started. Everybody started talking again. Now, next lab, same thing. We're standing outside, waiting to go in, waiting for the next last lab class to leave, and time for us to go in. We're all talking. Here comes Pam. Everything gets silent. They watch her walk by. Everything, all the noise comes again. And this happened for the entire semester. She was one of those eye-catching. There were no whistles or rude calls or, no one would dare to do something like that to somebody who was so obviously a lady and so obviously unaware of her appeal. But every single time she walked by, it got silent. Every man there watched her walk by, and then the conversation would start up again. I think I would have been really popular in chemistry lab had they known that she was my cousin. But I had much more fun simply watching the faces of these guys as they watched her walk down the walk. And she was totally unaware. She was totally unaware of her appeal and the effect that she had on men when she walked by. Just totally, totally unconscious of it. So it was a very beautiful thing to say. So, and my cousin Jim, her older brother, like my cousin Lester, simply named themselves as our second fathers, were very strict about, both of them, about whom we could date and when we had to be back in the dorm. And, well, in my day, they had hours, curfews, and bed checks. So, that wasn't too tough a job for them. But if they saw us dating somebody they didn't approve of, let me tell you, we heard about it. One Friday or Saturday night, Pam and I both had been invited to a fraternity house for a frat party. A young guy that I had gone to high school with had invited me because he was pledging this fraternity and wanted a date. And I don't know how Pam got her date. Somebody had asked her to go to this frat party too. And Pam and I just happened to end up arriving at the party at the same time. So while our dates were going and getting us drinks, Pam and I sat down on the sofa and were talking. And all of a sudden, the two of us hear this growl. Whoa, what the hell's going on here? Who invited them? Oh, I had no idea. I guess Pam may have, but I had no idea that my cousin Jim was the president of that fraternity. And he was not too happy to see his little sister and his cousin sitting on the sofa at that party. Needless to say, Pam and I didn't stay very long. Our dates took us home and never invited us again back to that fraternity house. I don't know what went on there, but Jim was not happy at all to have us there. So, at any rate, Jim was very big in ROTC and Army ROTC, as was my cousin Lester. Jim was commander of the Pershing Riflemen. Lester was the cadet commander of the counter-guerrilla unit. His friend Robbie was Corps commander, cadet Corps commander. So Pam and I did a lot of homework and had a lot of big brothers who happened to be in ROTC. Jim didn't make Pam have 2 dates to military balls. Lester made me have 2 dates. He said, yeah, no, it's safety in numbers, Any 2 guys ask you to go to the ball, you can go as long as you have 2 dates to the ball. So I was usually the date at the military ball for a guy who was engaged or 2 guys who were engaged to someone back home. It was safety in numbers for them. They could say, yeah, so-and-so and I took Lester's cousin to the military ball, you know. So it was safe. It was a safe bet for them too. I'll come back and tell some more stories about Lester and I. You've already heard one, but some more stories later on, maybe about him. But I want to go back to Uncle Raleigh and Aunt Audie, Pam's grandmother and grandfather. Now, Uncle Raleigh was usually busy at the mercantile or out doing something. Sometimes Aunt Audie would be sitting and cashiering at the mercantile, and sometimes she was at home. But in the mercantile, there was this big glass display case, and it was absolutely full of some of the most beautiful hand tatted lace you've ever seen in your life. There were pillowcases with hand tatted lace edgings, and there were dish towels, and we always called them antimacassars, the little thing that you put on the dresser, you can put stuff on so you don't scratch the dresser, or you can put it on the arm of the chair to protect the chair from wear and tear and stuff like that. And they all had beautiful lace, and then there were collars that you would just sew on. You'd make a dress or sew the collar on, and the collar was 100% lace, and she tatted it, and she would sit there with this ball of very thin cotton yarn, and she would have her tatting shuttle in her hand, and her hands moved so fast you really couldn't see what she was doing. I asked her one time if she would teach me to tat, and she was absolutely delighted because Pam had no interest in it. So we sat there, and I watched her, and I had to tell her, slow down, I can't see what you're doing, you're going so fast. And even when she put her hands on mine and I had the tatting shuttle in my hand, she moved so fast I couldn't see what I was doing. Needless to say, I never learned how to tat. I would love to. I would love to be able to do that because it's a series of knots that end up making some of the most beautiful lace. I mean, crocheted lace is beautiful, but hand tatted lace is durable and beautiful and can be much more intricate than crocheted lace. And because the knots are so tight, it takes shapes and forms like crochet lace can only do if you starch it. But birthdays, wedding gifts, baby gifts, everything you got from Aunt Audie had this hand tatted lace on it. And I know that in the mercantile they did have a place where they had store bought lace, but people would come to her and ask her if they were making something that they wanted to put lace on, because you can either tat the lace onto the pillowcase the way Aunt Dottie did, or you can sew, take a pillowcase or whatever you want and sew the lace on. So people would have Aunt Dottie make yards of certain kinds of lace. You know, it could be real thin, quarter of an inch lace, or it could be up to 2 or 3 inches wide, the lace that she would make. And it was absolutely beautiful. I never saw Aunt Audie sitting that she wasn't tatting. She was constantly, her hands constantly were moving, tatting. She was tiny like my grandmother. I don't think she was even 5 foot tall. A lot more round. My grandmother was very thin. Aunt Audie was round and squishy and huggable and all of that kind of stuff. So that was my grandmother's second brother. Her oldest brother was Marion. I met Uncle Marion that I remember probably only about 4 or 5 times. When before Honey and Granddad got married, um, Uncle Marion and his wife Golda moved to California, to the Imperial Valley. And Uncle Marion had a big farm there. I'm not sure what he raised on it. I'm pretty sure he raised garden crops like lettuce and cabbage and carrots and those kinds of things, because in those days that's pretty much what was raised in the Imperial Valley. And I know that we went to stay with Uncle Marion when I was 4 and my grandparents went. When I went back to California when I was 5 with my parents, we didn't stay with Uncle Marion. We stayed with his oldest son, Alton. And then when I was 14, my honey wanted me to experience riding on a train. And they were getting ready to do away with, cancel, stop passenger train service going through Carrizozo. So one Christmas, my grandmother took me with her, and we rode the train out to Los Angeles. And Uncle Alton, and his wife Janie met us at the train station, and we stayed with them for about a week and a half, and then got on the train. We stayed with them over Christmas for sure, and then we got on the train and went home. But while we were there, we went over into the Imperial Valley and visited with Uncle Marion. Most of his family was there. They all came to visit to talk with Honey. I was pretty much the only teenager who was there, so I found other things to do like read and help out in the kitchen and stuff like that. And I know a couple of times Uncle Marion came here. I don't know much about him. I know he had the farm. I know he raised his kids there, and that's about it. I don't know outside of Alton and Janie and their kids. I did not spend much time with any other of Uncle Marion's family. I spent a lot of time with Alton and Janie because they came probably every other summer to visit Honey and Granddad. And even after I was married, when my husband was stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Alton and Janie came and visited with us. I have a photograph, one of the last ones I have of Alton with my nephew JB and with my boys. They had been visiting and he had been playing with them, and one of my boys heard the ice cream truck and said ice cream truck and was out the front door. So Alton was out with them and he bought them all an ice cream. And I stepped out the door and took a picture of all of them together. That's one of the last pictures I have of Uncle Alton. So that's pretty much my grandmother's family. I'm not sure where we're going to go from here. I would like to tell you what story I'm going to tell you next time, but I don't know yet. I'll have to think about it. So I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.